Have you ever stopped to think about how, the stories we get told growing up, the people around us, our experiences, how it all kind of weaves together to make us who we are?
Oh, absolutely. It's a fascinating process. Our identities aren't just handed to us, are they? They're built bit by bit through family, history, community.
Exactly. And that's why today we're doing a deep dive into some really powerful source material. We're looking at specific excerpts from Barack Obama's Dreams from My Father, a story of race and inheritance.
And he himself calls it an honest account of a particular province of my life. Not just a standard memoir, but something quite specific.
Right. So our mission really is to unpack the insights found directly in these pages. We want to explore how those early influences, his racial awakenings, that whole journey of self-discovery, shaped his understanding of identity and community, all based on his own words.
It's a chance to see how he grappled with these big themes, identity, race, belonging, through his own experiences as he wrote them down.
So let's start with where the book even came from. It's kind of surprising, actually. He says he initially intended a very different book.
Yeah, that was after the burst of publicity when he became the first Black president of the Harvard Law Review. Big deal at the time.
Huge. But he notes, quite humbly actually, that the attention maybe testified less to my modest accomplishments than to Harvard Law School's peculiar place in the American mythology.
As well as America's hunger for any optimistic sign from the racial front. That's a key insight right there. He felt the pressure, the expectation.
He did. He thought he had, and I'm quoting here, something original to say about the current state of race relations. More academic, maybe?
Seems like it. More outward-looking. But the process, well, it seemed to force him inward, didn't it? Memoirs often do that. You start thinking you'll analyze something out there, but you end up excavating in here.
That's a great way to put it. From public analysis to personal excavation. And right there in that personal space is his mother. He talks about mourning her deeply.
Calls her the kindest, most generous spirit I have ever known. It's incredibly moving.
And he says, what is best in me I owe to her. He even sees her joy, her capacity for wonder in his own daughters. It's such a powerful grounding in kindness, not just, ambition or ideology.
Absolutely. And he paints this picture of her unique perspective, her needlepoint virtues, her kind of New Deal, Peace Corps, position paper liberalism.
Right. A lonely witness for secular humanism, he calls her, especially where they lived sometimes.
That belief in individual agency, kindness, it clearly stuck with him. It's a core theme.
And you really get her personality with that Cheshire Cat joke about guilt.
Oh, yeah. A healthy dose of guilt never hurt anybody. It's what civilization was built on.
A highly underrated emotion. It's funny, but it also tells you something about her, doesn't it?
It really does. And then there are the grandparents, Gramps and Toot. Real mix of, let's say, myth and reality shaping him.
Toot, his grandmother, sounds like the anchor. He calls her the calm, insightful voice of reason, someone whose stories he trusted because they just felt like common sense.
Yeah, the grounding force.
But Gramps sounds like a whole different story. More charisma, maybe? A bit of a myth maker?
Definitely. The author describes him with a wise guy grin and a tendency to rewrite his history.
Like that story about holding his father over a railing. Sounds intense. A fearsome vision of justice, he calls it.
But apparently his mother later said, well, it wasn't quite like that, gently correcting the family lore.
What's really interesting, though, is how the author connects Gramps' own feeling of being an outsider, feeling like a walk, he says, to his view of Black people's struggles.
Right. It's like Gramps created this internal fiction, projecting his own feelings of marginalization onto his son-in-law's race. He wanted that connection to be true.
And later saw the author's father as embodying, Kennedy's New Frontier and Dr. King's magnificent dream. It's a lot of projection.
While Teet's stories, they bring you right back down to earth. Sharp, painful realities.
Like in Texas, the furniture salesman telling Gramps, if the coloreds want to look, they need to come after hours. Just awful.
And at her bank job, the secretary hissing at her not to call the janitor, Mr. Reed, Mr. Just call no nigger, Mr.
And finding Mr. Reed weeping later, it shows the deep personal wound of that kind of disrespect. It's not abstract.
Not at all. And Toot herself, she was breaking barriers, right? First woman vice president of a local bank.
Yeah, but even that caused friction. Her earning more than Gramps became a source of delicacy and bitterness, adds another layer to the family dynamic.
So all these complex family stories, these encounters with race, They really set the stage for his own internal journey.
He talks about seeing a photograph early on and feeling the sense of a hidden enemy. That race could somehow reach me without anyone's knowledge, not even my own. That's chilling for a
It
kid.
really shows how insidious racism can be, how it seeps into your consciousness before you can even name it.
And then in high school, those blunt conversations with his friend Ray.
Yeah, Ray just laying it out. We were always playing on the white man's court, by the white man's rules. Stark.
That realization sounds crushing. The author describes the maddening logic where it almost didn't matter if someone was a good or bad white person. The power structure felt overwhelming, leading to this feeling of, well, powerlessness and rage.
It's a tough spot. And you see him drawn to Malcolm X, the repeated acts of self-creation, that unadorned insistence on respect. There's an appeal there.
But he couldn't fully embrace it, could he? He mentions Malcolm's wish to expunge white blood, but knew his own white blood would never recede into mere abstraction.
Exactly. That's the core conflict. He couldn't just pick a side. His identity was inherently mixed, inherently complex. He had to wrestle with that.
So how did that wrestling match continue when he moved to Indonesia with Lolo, his stepfather?
Ah, yes, Indonesia. A very different environment. Lolo taught him the world was violent, unpredictable, and often cruel. Very pragmatic.
Direct advice, too. You will be a man someday, and a man needs to have more sense. Basically, take life on its own terms.
And seeing the corruption there, it apparently bred this relentless skepticism in him. Suddenly, his mother's idealism, her needlepoint virtues, started to seem, well, impractical against that backdrop.
Real world hit and hard.
Definitely challenging that inherited worldview.
And that skepticism, or maybe weariness, seems to carry into his high school years back in the States. He talks about putting books aside, learning the trick of not caring that it hurts.
Sounds like teenage disillusionment, but amplified, right? That feeling of being tired of trying to untangle a mess that wasn't of my making?
Very relatable, yet so specific to his situation. And then at Occidental College, he discovers this well-kept secret about Black people.
That most of us weren't interested in revolt, that most of us were tired of thinking about race all the time.
That's fascinating. It cuts against stereotypes, doesn't it? This deep desire for just peace, for normalcy.
It does. And it all seems to come to a head at that student rally he mentions.
Oh, right, where he gives a speech, but his voice barely carried. He felt it was a farce, like a school play.
And then tells his friend Regina flat out, I've decided I've got no business speaking for Black folks.
Wow. That's a really significant moment of doubt, of feeling inadequate.
A real crisis of purpose, maybe? But that reluctance, that feeling of inadequacy, it actually seems to push him towards something different. Not speaking for people in the abstract, but working with them.
Which leads him eventually to Chicago. But first, New York, working in a big corporation.
Right. Feeling like a spy behind enemy lines, he says, often the only Black man. Observing the city's polarization almost like a force of nature.
And getting pulled in different directions, advice-wise.
Oh, completely. You had the Black secretarial pool seeing his potential to maybe run the company someday, go the corporate route.
Then Ike, the security guard, saying basically, forget about this organizing business, make some money. Practical, but different advice.
Totally. And then you have the corporate civil rights director saying, protest and pickets won't cut it anymore. It's all about public-private partnerships.
So corporate ladder, grassroots organizing, pragmatic money-making, establishment partnerships, lots of voices telling him what success looks like.
Exactly. No easy answers.
Yeah.
Which probably pushed him to find his own way, to listen differently.
Like in Smitty's barbershop in Chicago, he paints such a vivid picture of that.
Yeah, the familiar barbershop banter, the conversations intimate and anonymous, a space where men could just be, where they agreed to leave their troubles outside.
Kind of sanctuary.
Seems like it. A place to hear unfiltered truths. And he also picked up on this disquiet among older Black residents.
Worries about decay, crime, kids leaving or getting into trouble.
And that poignant question they weren't asking themselves. What it is that we've done to make so many children's hearts so hard. A real call for introspection.
Which brings us to Altgeld Gardens, a key part of the story. Described as a dump, yeah, but also a place to house poor Blacks, yet still holding this lingering idea of home.
That enduring need for belonging, even in tough circumstances. But organizing there was hard work.
Marty's advice sounds pretty brutal. If you're going to do this work, Barack, you've got to stop worrying about whether people like you. They won't.
Oh, tough love. Necessary, maybe, Change isn't about being liked.
But he finds these incredible women there, Linda, Bernadette, Sadie, with quiet ambition.
Yeah, dreams of bright white kitchens and hardwood floors, swimming lessons, ballet for the kids. Very real human aspirations, not abstract politics.
And Sadie's transformation is amazing. From being scared to talk on TV.
To standing up and saying, we don't need donuts, we need answers.
Now it's so direct.
So powerful.
It cuts right through the noise.
And it worked. They got a victory with the Chicago Housing Authority, the CHA. He writes that Sadie's small, honest step had broken into a reservoir of hope.
Allowing people in alt-guild to reclaim a power they had had all along. That's the core of community organizing, isn't it? Helping people find their own power.
It really is. And this whole experience, it seems to fundamentally shift his thinking about identity.
How so?
He realizes that notions of purity of race or of culture could no more serve as the basis for the typical Black American self-esteem than it could for mine. Purity wasn't the answer. It wasn't even possible for most people.
So if not purity, then what? Where does that sense of self come from?
From embracing the complexity, he says, our sense of wholeness would have to arise from something more fine than the bloodlines we'd inherited. It has to be rooted in all the messy, contradictory details of our experience.
Accepting the messiness, the contradictions, not trying to simplify it.
Exactly. And finding connection in shared struggle, like that moment in church he describes. Feeling tears, feeling faith, feeling carried this far by the community. It's a powerful spiritual grounding in that shared experience.
That journey inward, grounded in community, then leads him outward again, doesn't it, to Kenya? To confront his father's side of the story, his ancestry.
Right. And one of the first things he describes is just hearing his name recognized. Miss Amoro, knowing the name Obama.
He says it gave him this sense of comfort, the firmness of identity that a name might provide, and then that had never happened before. My name belonged, and so I belonged.
After feeling so often like he didn't quite fit anywhere, that must have been incredibly profound, just belonging through a name.
But Kenya also brings new complexities. He learns about the big man system.
Yeah, the idea that it's all about who are your relatives, who do you know? If you don't have connections, you can forget it.
Which directly challenged his father's belief that education alone was the key, right? Shows how culture shapes opportunity.
Absolutely. And he meets relatives who give him different windows onto Kenyan life, like Bernard wanting to be a man of action, like Rambo.
And the author pushing him to, set goals, take some responsibility.
Or, say, talking about male-female dynamics, how our men, we try to be strong, but our strength is often misplaced. These intimate family insights.
And there are granny stories, going way back.
Yeah, that oral history. Life before the white man came, governed by elders, distinct roles for men and women.
And his grandfather, Onyango, being unusual because he learned English, learned paper records, became useful to the white man.
Which led to people thinking he was crazy for living in a tent. It shows how adapting to the new ways could seem strange within the old context.
And those stories highlight the massive shifts after colonialism arrived. Land getting crowded, traditions weakening, elders losing authority.
People starting to feel poor in comparison to the new ways. A real sense of disruption and loss.
We also hear about Onyango's own defiance, his hardness, issues with his wife Akumu, who maybe still loved the man she was supposed to marry.
It's layers upon layers of family history. And then his own father, Barack Sr., struggles getting fired, estranged from Onyango, proud but maybe bending the truth about his job, his time in prison. It's not a simple hero story.
No, it's deeply human, deeply complex, shaped by history, by colonialism, by personal choices.
And Rukia's comment really hits hard. The worst thing that colonialism did was cloud our view of our past.
Making people cling to traditions, she suggests, like polygamy or collective land ownership, that might have outlived their usefulness or even become tools for abuse. That's a tough reflection on how the past gets distorted.
It is. And he sees echoes of struggles back home, too. Returning to Chicago, he notices the decay accelerated, neighborhoods shabbier, kids edgier.
It connects back to that earlier disquiet, that question about why kids' hearts are hardening. It's a persistent challenge, both locally and globally.
And ultimately, his journey seems to lead him to conclude that just having faith in oneself was never enough.
It requires more.
Yeah, commitment, sacrifices, the kind he saw in community leaders he admired. Purpose isn't just found inside, it's built through action, through connecting with others.
So, looking back at this whole journey through his words, we see the family influence, the wrestling with race, the search for purpose and community, It really shows how wholeness comes from embracing all those messy, contradictory details, not from some idea of purity.
Exactly. His story, as he tells it, becomes this incredible map for understanding how identity is forged through inheritance, experience, and conscious choice.
So, for you listening, thinking about this journey, how does your own story get shaped? By the past, the challenges you face now, the communities you're part of, what are those messy, contradictory details that make up your sense of wholeness?
It's interesting. The author reflects that the civil rights movement did create more room to maneuver for people like him, more options of different paths you could take.
Right. You could be the community organizer downtown or the corporate lawyer on the South Side, as he puts it. More choices existed.
But that leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? Even with more room to maneuver, what does it really take to build not just individual success, but collective self-esteem? How do we together write that moral compass when inequalities are still so persistent?
That's definitely something to think about long after we finish talking about this book, a challenge that remains very real.